Recorded live at the center of the earth. This is Robots from Tomorrow.
Welcome to Robots from Tomorrow. My name is Greg. Glad to have you with us. If you're just joining us for the first time and dig what we do here on the show, you can follow us in a number of ways. We have a YouTube channel with videos of current episodes and a growing number of episodes from our back catalog. These are our way of giving you more pictures during our talks about words and pictures. RobotsFromTomorrow.com is our website and the only place you can find all of our 800 plus prior episodes categorized and free of charge. And if you want to experience the show in its natural habitat, the only place to do that is, of course, MultiversityComics.com. Multiversity Comics is still one of the best ways to stay informed about the wide world of comics. The site is updated multiple times a day with all manner of news, reviews, interviews, other podcasts like Make Mine Multiversity, the DC3 Cast, and more. There's a pretty good chance every time you head over to MultiversityComics.com, you'll find something new. And speaking of new, today is the last of our three-part series on the greatest Superman comics of the Bronze Age, with my guest, the DC3 Cast's very own Vince Ostrowski. Our Super Chat wraps up the Bronze Age with the revamping of two classic Superman villains. Lex Luthor gets his green and purple power suit, while Brainiac transforms into his robotic form. Superman teams up with OMAC, Adam Strange, the new Teen Titans, and the Earth Prime Superboy, which means we're now at the time of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Excerpts of that story are sprinkled across these issues, enough for readers to get a complete understanding of the larger story that weaves itself through several of the comics included. And, of course, there is the Alan Moore of it all. Most of the comics we'll talk about today are available on DC Universe Infinite, but I've included more detailed availability information in the show notes for this episode. So settle in once again for the return of Vince Ostrowski as we wrap up our look at the best Superman stories of the Bronze Age. Sure, these are just imaginary stories compared to current continuity, but then again, aren't they all? Okay, so we're talking about our Superman in the Bronze Age trilogy of collections. This is now volume 3, bringing together of everything as we move into Crisis and then beyond. Before I get into what issues are collected in this, I'm going to throw it out to my guest here. Vince, what did you think of this book versus the last two? What were your thoughts? Where does this sort of fall in the not really trilogy?
Well, this one is just banger after banger, I think. Like, this is, yeah. I mean, not that the first two volumes I thoroughly enjoyed reading through, but it's kind of fascinating how you can see what we think of as Bronze Age Superman really develop over these 3 volumes, because even in the beginning, it's not really what you think of as kind of some of the hallmarks of the Bronze Age. Obviously, by the end, you start to notice the things that people mostly talk about when they talk about the Bronze Age. And a lot of that is to do with the Alan Moore stuff, obviously, but it's also some of the Perez stuff starts showing up here. I mean, we'll get more into it. I don't want to jump the gun, but something like Superman 400, you know, the places that goes, that's what you think of when you think of the Bronze Age. But the early Bronze Age wasn't ready to go there yet. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so by the time you get to volume 3 here, I mean, that's where all the most memorable stuff that I ate up. So I wasn't around during the Bronze Age, but like, you know, earlier in my comics fandom, the kind when you're kind of reading the classics or whatever, so much of that stuff became more recognizable and for good reason, because I think it's no secret, but Alan Moore's pretty good at writing comics. You know?
Yeah.
Gil Kane and Kurt Swan are very good at drawing comics. George Perez is very good at drawing comics. And you're just getting hit with wave after wave of this stuff. Some of it very much in the prime of their talents, I think. So Yeah, this is like volumes 1 and 2 are great table setters, and then this is kind of where it all pays off, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, in a way that I don't think you have with Batman.
Mm.
The Superman stuff, it takes a while to coalesce in a
Hmm.
way that maybe because the character can do so much, there are so many different aspects that you can use him for or use him with, that the Bronze Age stuff takes a little longer to come together in these last couple of years, which happens to be in this book. And yeah, spoiler alert, there's going to be a lot of Alan Moore, I would say slobbery, but I mean, it's really good stuff. But there were other people that wrote Superman during this time and did it really, really well. So, Volume 3, Action Comics 544 through 546, Superman 385, 386, DC Comics Presents 61, back to Action Comics for 554, back to Superman for issue 400, over to DC Comics Presents 85, over to Superman 412, 413, over to Superman Annual number 11, DC Comics Presents 82, Crisis on Infinite Earths number 7, DC Comics Presents 87, Superman issue 414, DC Comics Presents 97, and then the final duo of Superman 423 and Action Comics 583. Now, those are a lot of numbers. As we have done before, as we go through, we will group them into their component stories. But right off the bat, we have Action Comics 544, which unfortunately is not on DC Unlimited.
Mm-hmm.
DC Unlimited? DC Infinite. Damn it, I do that every time.
Yeah, whatever it is.
Yeah. It's not on DC Infinite. Hopefully at some point it will be, because it is such a pivotal comic, for Superman and for Lex Luthor and for Brainiac, who are relatively important characters in the Superman canon. This oversized issue, it was the 45th anniversary issue, the revamp of Luthor and the revamp of Brainiac. So this is where the green and purple suit, the battle suit, this gets introduced. And this is where the mechanical Brainiac versus the green-skinned blonde Kaluan, right? That's where he's from.
Yeah,
something like that. He goes from like the human Brainiac to the metal Brainiac.
Mm-hmm.
The Luthor part is by Kurt Swan, written by Cary Bates, and the Brainiac stuff is Marv Wolfman and Gil Kane. The redesign was, I believe, George Perez did the Luthor suit and Ed Hannigan did the Brainiac redesign. So what did you think?
Well, I'm pretty familiar with the Brainiac relaunch or reboot or whatever you want to call it. I was familiar with that stuff before reading this. The Luthor stuff, obviously his classic green and purple, like you mentioned, the power suit. Obviously that's very memorable and used over and over and over again over the years. But the stuff that I found most fascinating about this, which I didn't know very much about, if anything, was the stuff with his wife and son and the planet Lexor.
Yeah.
I mean, this gives you kind of a tragic setup to the new Luthor.
Oh yeah.
With Lexor blowing up and his wife and child dying, and I don't recall that stuff at all. And I'm sure, like, I might be wrong, but that sounds like something Johns would reference later. But for the most part, creators don't touch that aspect of pre-crisis Luthor. You really don't hear about it very often at all. And I thought that was really effective stuff, surprisingly. And it makes me wonder if we'll ever see that again in any meaningful sense in new DCU comics. But if we don't, I think this Action Comics 544 is a good read. I think the stuff that's done with Lex there is really, there's this really interesting sense of contentment that Cary Bates gives the character, and yet there's still this like bubbling hatred of Superman underneath, but at least Lex has something to go back to remind himself that, no, I have I have something more important, something better in my life that I could focus on, and then that gets taken away from him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, oh man. And his fault too.
Oh yeah.
It being his fault, and then of course another thing he can blame on Superman though. So
Yeah.
just real
Yeah.
great classic Lex stuff.
I can't remember where I first saw it. It certainly wasn't the first place that it showed up, but it was the idea that, and I guess this maybe runs true for all sort of the top tier villains. I guess you could make sort of the same case with Doom, is that basically the problem with Lex is that he could be such a force for good if he could just get over Superman. And the real tragedy for Luthor, and I think, Superman mentions this throughout their career, is that if he could just stop having to devote everything to defeating this alien, he could be the greatest hero, in some ways a better hero than Superman. Maybe not better, but like certainly as loved as Superman, but he just can't do it. And this Lexor stuff, I think it's a Silver Age concept that gets pulled into the Bronze Age, and it's very much a scientist Luthor trope rather than businessman Luthor trope. So, it'd be sort of tough to update. But I think, and this is true with a lot of these Silver Age concepts brought into the Bronze Age by writers like Bates and Hagen and Wolfman, is it hasn't quite shaken off that don't think too hard about how it actually works. Just go with the emotion of it, you know? Like you said, when you go with that emotion, you really do feel for Luthor. I thought very effective. And then going into the Brainiac stuff, the mechanical Brainiac was the first Brainiac I was introduced to. So It's always weird for me to see quote unquote human Brainiac and think of him as the prior, because the mechanical Brainiac, which I guess I saw in Superpowers.
That's who Brainiac is. Yeah. He's not this green Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
Which is essentially how he was drawn at first.
Right. So seeing him give up his body and like download his consciousness into this robot body, almost body horror type of situation, is an interesting take. Another one of the reasons I wanted to have, this in here is because this is some more obviously Gil Kane stuff. Kane does the 3 issues that we have in here that follow this Brainiac story, and then he does another a little later on. But Kane, I think, is an interesting artist. Actually, let me throw it out to you. When you think of Gil Kane, what his art means to you?
I always think of Spider-Man, still to this day. Like I think my impression of it is that that's his stronger work. Not that this isn't good. This is a treat to look at, but he's getting looser here in a way that I think on the Spider-Man stuff or his work at Marvel is a little bit more trying to stick to a house style or something. Maybe a little more, and here he expands a bit and gets very weird with perspective at times. And in 545, there's some images of Superman like running through Brainiac's ship, and they're just bizarre perspectives that I really like, but I don't picture this stuff. I picture the Spidey stuff, oddly enough. Yeah. So that was part of the joy of reading this volume 3, was getting to experience a Gil Kane that I had never gotten as much of, even if I kind of think I prefer the Spider-Man stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You can have preferences of an artist's work of one over the other, but still like enjoy both of them for different reasons. I mean, remembering off the top of my head, the Spider-Man stuff was also inked by either like Jim Mooney or Romita Sr. So I
think a lot of it was Romita, and then that it kind of hewed a little more closely to Romita as a result.
Yeah, because Jazzy Johnny, he was not a pinup artist, but like he was a romance artist before being pulled into the whole superhero stuff. So his people look beautiful. Like he cannot not draw a beautiful looking person, man or woman. Gil, not quite so much. So I mean,
they're not handsome
like
necessarily.
He can, but so here for this run of stuff, he's inking himself. He'll give his, ironically, I think a little almost like Romita Jr. is, he will give his characters a little more facial definition in a way that can read as a little overwrought in some ways. But his figure work I've always found interesting. And the thing I've also found interesting about Kane, and somebody articulated this pretty well recently, and of course I forgot who it was, but that he was able to hit on a dynamism in his art in a way that wasn't a direct Kirby clone, right? Like there's maybe a grace or a flow to Kane's stuff that Kirby didn't have, that was a different flavor. So that almost sort of sets him apart than a lot of his contemporaries. Also, he has a very dynamic / idiosyncratic way of drawing machinery and aliens and starships. So in a way that you can look at a scientist's laboratory drawn by Kirby, drawn by Byrne, and drawn by Kane, and they all look different. Like you can immediately tell who's doing what and what and what. To have this, to be able to show the Kane version of Superman's fortress, where, you know, Superman's sitting in front of a big monitor where he's got his supercomputer working on something, you know, like that'll look different than a George Perez or, you know, Byrne and stuff that we'll see later. So in addition to being a really good revamp of these characters, I like immersing myself in the Kane version of these characters for a little bit. It's nice to have some variations.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to mention about this story was just how every subsequent installment of it kind of adds in more of the DCU supporting cast in a way that makes it feel, I don't want to say like an event, but like more event-y than your average arc. And again, that's a thing that started to get developed in the Bronze Age, I believe. Like, I know there were plenty of team ups before this. You know, there were entire books that are made up of team ups, but just the sense of, you're getting more and more of a sense that everything is connected. Instead of, Batman pops into Clark's book for an issue or two, all of this stuff is actually existing in the same world, and anyone could show up at any time. And you get that with 545. You get the Forgotten Heroes, which was a fun little. You get like Rip Hunter and Cave Carson and Dolphin. And then 546, you actually get like a mega team up where the JLA and the Teen Titans get involved. So yeah, it really big time stuff. You know, it is a big deal. Like they are treated as like cameos in this massive showdown, but again, it's like they're part of this living, breathing universe now. So it's not, Batman, what are you doing in my book? You know, it's oh no, we're all part of the same universe and we're in this together, and this is a job that requires everyone. It's something that we will see a lot more in the post-crisis schema.
Yeah, it's a nice use by Wolfman of saying, like, look, I need to show how serious of a thing this is. So Superman is going to call in the Justice League. And of course, Kid Flash and Flash happen to be having a discussion when he goes onto the satellite to say, hey, we need the Justice League. And Kid Flash is like, do you need the Titans too? And he says, quote, I'd use Bozo the Clown if he'd help. You're like, okay, well, and Marv Wolfman being, of course, the writer for Teen Titans, he's like, I think they're available. So then you get a really nice splash page of the Titans and the Justice Leaguers catching up, getting little snippets of, so you have like Wonder Woman and Wonder Girl, Wonder Woman saying, congratulations to Wonder Girl, I hear you're getting married. And then you have Wonder Girl saying, I love him, he's really the right man for me, to which makes me cringe just a little bit, because I mean, Marv Wolfman is a hell of a writer. Terry Long, that's a bitter fucking bill. Anyway, yeah, but you know, seeing Kane handle a large cast like this, he totally does. I'm sure it wasn't easy, but he handles his stuff well. I got a little kick out of seeing Tara for a couple of panels, and being like, oh, okay, I guess that's when this story takes place, pre-Judah's contract, but
pre-Deathstroke stuff.
Yeah. So, and then we've got the Superman 385 and 386. Luthor Rises Again. These are also not collected on DC Infinite or actually in any trades, which I am sort of surprised by that.
Wild.
Yeah, I would have thought there would have been like because I know there have been Luthor collections.
Sure. Yeah, they did like 80 years of Luthor, whatever. Must not have had any of these.
So anything jump out for you on these?
Just one thing that these issues made me think is that the Bronze Age, you know, and I think I said this about volume 1 and 2, but it's even stronger in your volume 3 here. pre the Bronze Age, a lot of it was very much surface level emotion. I'm in love with this person, or it's unrequited love, or, I need to keep my identity from them because reasons. And just the kind of exploration of emotions and why people feel the way they do, or what effect they have on people, are a little more rich in the Bronze Age. And specifically, I noticed some stuff over 385 and 386 about Luthor really dealing with guilt and where to place the blame, which again, like, ultimately
it's not going to him.
Right. But he struggles with it more than a cookie cutter villain of the past would have, he grapples with it more. And yeah, ultimately, obviously misplaces it onto Superman, because that's the Luthor thing. But I was just impressed with how, he's building his new base, and he's kind of walking around, and he's at a loss, and he's taking his frustrations out in a way that it's not the cackling villain that you would have seen in the Silver Age, or God forbid, the Golden Age. It's really more than that. And I'm not saying it's like it's not like Shakespearean, although maybe it is like maybe it is the DC corporate Cape Comics version of that sort of wallowing in guilt and loss. It really starts to show itself in these Bronze Age stories.
Yeah. Again, these are Cary Bates, Kurt Swan, Dave Hunt inking, and Kurt Swan, just the rock of Superman artistry for, I forgot to check the dates, but at least at this time, it's got to be like 20 years. Yeah. Right. Like, he started in the 60s, so now we're in the early 80s. And it is interesting to have the characterizations of these characters changing minutely, maybe a little more, but to have the same artist on it for such a long time, it can in some ways maybe mask the change, but also maybe make it feel comforting. Like, hey, here's the Superman I've always known, but it's feeling a little more dimensional. If not three-dimensional, maybe two-dimensional, Yeah. So another reason to have this in here is to keep establishing or reestablish where the super books are at this point. Here's the Kurt Swan art, still killing it, but the best is yet to come. All right, next, DC Comics presents 61, Superman and OMAC, the one-man Army Corps, written by Len Wein, drawn by George Perez. A couple of different reasons to put this book in here. One, DC Comics presents, they're like the Marvel Team Up or the Marvel 2-in-1 books. You get to have Superman interacting with the larger DC universe in a little more concentrated way. OMAC, an interesting Kirby creation. But more importantly, maybe for me putting this together, I wanted to start introducing George Perez earlier in the continuum, so that you can look at this and be like, God damn, that guy's really got it going on. And then you, of course, get to Crisis, which we'll see it a little bit. And you're like, oh, I don't know how he could level up, but he leveled up because, so good. And this story is, like, it's good. I don't remember there being anything, like, too revelatory in it. But, man, it sure looks good.
Yeah, it's notable for its art. It's the action is so thrilling. It's this magnificent blend of Kirby stuff with the Perez visuals, and of course Perez is influenced to a certain degree by Kirby, I'm sure. But yeah, just a wonderful blend of that stuff. But yeah, mostly it's just an action romp, right? It's OMAC following the murder mech, crossing paths with Superman to take it down, and of course Superman mistakes OMAC for a villain. Or for the perpetrator, and then they have to team up, and it's just kind of a classic no frills story in that way, but the art sure is notable.
It does set up also, if you're coming into this book cold, Perez's way of doing bigger action with smaller panels, which again comes into play later. Okay, Action 554. This is a one-off issue written again by Marv Wolfman, drawn by Gil Kane. If Superman didn't exist, ...
We'd have to invent him.
And they do. How did this strike you?
I loved this. I thought, I mean, I don't think they're not subtle at all that it's the actual creators of Superman that are supposed to be the principal characters in this one. And then of course at the end you get a really uncanny looking young Jack Kirby and Joe Simon thinking about inventing some characters as well. And it's so sweet. And yeah, Gil Kane's like loving renderings of some of these creators as children, or whatever, however you want to put it. Really nice touch too. So yeah, very, very cute story. And again, something in the Bronze Age where like comics are beginning to become metatextual in a way that they weren't before either. This would have been after Flash of Two Worlds, right?
Yeah.
So obviously like the Flash was big on becoming metatextual and talking about literally meeting their creators or giving them ideas for stories or whatever, but it really ramps up in the Bronze Age, and comics start to become about something other than the conflict on the pages at times. And that's really exciting to see develop too.
I had heard about this story before I'd read it. There was a Wizards Death of Superman special that had at the end of it a top 10 Superman stories, and that's where I first heard about Superman Muhammad Ali. That's probably where I first heard about this. That's where I saw a couple of panels from a later story that we're going to get into. So I wouldn't say the bar for this story for me was super high, but it was certainly like I came into it going, okay, this is going to make me feel something. And I read it and I was like, yep, that is pretty good. Just really, really good. This is available. I can finally get to something that's actually on DC Infinite. People should definitely check out, which is good because the next book we're going to talk about, Superman 400, is not on DC Infinite. It's also not been reprinted in its entirety, which is frustrating. And I say that because this is it's Superman 400, so it is a bunch of pages, because they did not number them really sequentially, but let's say it's like at least 48 pages made up of a series of shorter stories, all written by Elliot Maggin, but drawn by different creators. So there's a anthology feel to it. So some of the stories have been reprinted out of context in Greatest Superman Stories collections. I think the Steranko story at the end was in like Greatest Superman Stories Volume 2. The Frank Miller, a couple of pages, are in Superman 75th anniversary, or no, 75 years of Superman. So it's been kind of pilfered for stories, but I would like to see a front to back reprinting of this thing, because some of the artists they have in here for the stories or for the pinups are really, yeah.
The pinups have like the best of the best,
Yeah.
DC does a lot of these tribute issues or anniversary issues or whatever, and they include lots of great contemporary artists these days doing pinups and whatnot. But the sheer number of memorable names doing pinups in this thing, like you're talking about Will Eisner, Mobius, guys you just can't get anymore for a variety of obvious reasons. And you got Steve Ditko, you got Jerry Robinson, you got, who else is in there? Walt Simonson, Mike Grell, Brian Bolland, of course. Jack Davis. Oh, I love Jack Davis's pinup in this. Yeah.
You got Bernie Wrightson, or pre Man of Steel Burn. So this is like 83, 84, somewhere around there. So interesting to see his take on it before he gets onto it. Yeah, and those are just the pinups. The Bill Sienkiewicz does a really, really wonderful pinup. Jerry Robinson, Frank Miller does the back cover. Now, in terms of the interior artists, did any particularly stand out for you?
Boy, Klaus Janson is always underrated. He's one that I never think of or name when I talk about like my favorite artists, classic artists, whatever. But every time I read his work, I sure do like it.
Yeah. That's a good attitude to have. That will come in handy in about 5 minutes.
Oh, is this the one that
Oh no, that's a different one.
Oh,
But there is there is
okay.
another issue coming up
Oh,
that
yes.
that I picked, largely for that reason. And I've been on record as being quite the fan of Mr. Jansen, so that is a popular opinion to have.
Yeah.
So in terms of the actual, not actual artists, but in terms of the story artists, we have Joe Orlando, editor at DC at the time, but also one of the EC Comics alumni. So that guy's so good. And then we get into Al Williamson, another EC alum, and then Frank Miller, and then Marshall Rogers, Terry Austin, and then Wendy Pinney. I can't remember how her name's.
I think you got it.
So we'll say Penny. Apologies if that is incorrect. Of course, ElfQuest. It'd been out for a little bit, but it didn't have the decades of weight behind it that it has now. So in terms of reaching back and getting more classic artists, we've done that. Now we're getting sort of the younger Turks. Kaluta.
Oh, I love the art on that one.
Starstruck era. Kaluta. So good. And then, of course, into Klaus Janson, penciling, inking, and coloring. This is something we will get into again in a few minutes. And then Steranko finishes it off with a not quite comics.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it is and it isn't. Like there are panels, there is a panel progression, but there's sort of a lot going on. And honestly, as much as I have issues with the man now, this story, it is good. Like it is really, really, it's doing something.
Yeah, the art is amazing, but it's going for something that's like transcendent. I don't even know if I can explain what the story is.
Right.
But
right.
It's going for something on the level of like biblical lore by the end of it,
yeah.
but like future biblical.
Yeah. And a lot of that, I mean, Magan wrote the whole story, and in his stuff and also his Superman novels, outside of this, like Last Son of Krypton and Miracle Monday, are really big about looking at Superman in like a wider context. So that doesn't really surprise me.
I thought Steranko wrote this one. I thought
no. It's all. It
says writer, illustrator, letter, color.
Oh, you know
Steranko.
What? You are correct.
It's the one thing in the book that's not Magan, I think.
That's right. That's right.
Which makes sense because it is bug nuts in a way that that
yeah.
Only the mind of Steranko could go here.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. That might be why this hasn't been reprinted. Now that you say that, I mean, this was reprinted once, but because it's his, I think the reprint option, has lapsed. So like that's why it hasn't been included since, and maybe they don't want to reprint the rest of the stuff without it. I feel like I read that somewhere. Hopefully that's true, which is a shame because this is worth having eyeballs on it, bug nuts as it is. Yeah, so as a celebration of Superman in pop culture, like getting Steve Ditko to do a pinup, yeah, good stuff. Okay, I guess we're jumping maybe a year later. Superman 412 and 413. This is the culmination of the Luthor's Revenge plot. Clark Kent gets fired.
Yeah, for fake news.
Yeah. So this is, let's say, Carrie. Is this also Carrie Bates?
Carrie Bates.
Bates, Kurt Swan, now inked by Al Williamson. Swan Williamson. Oh, so good. And it's interesting to see Kurt Swan as the bedrock of the art on so many of these Superman stories. But you see the change in inker. If you really want to, you can, if you were inclined to do something as sort of crazy as this, figure out like what the penciler does versus what the inker does. Right. So in terms of like texturing, it'll really become apparent when we see Kurt Swan towards the end of the book. But yeah, anything about these couple of issues that jump out?
I don't know. Not particularly that we didn't already cover, I think.
Okay.
But of course it's appreciated to have them here because it's the culmination of that storyline. So
yeah. In picking some of these, that was one of the criteria, right? Like, do I have to include this in order to sort of finish off, this little story. Interestingly enough, the end of this story, Lex and Superman are fighting, and Lex gets sucked up into a large swirling cloud, whatever. And it says, blah, 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 blah. Editor's note for the spellbinding answer to where Lex Luthor has gone. Dear reader, be sure to see Crisis on Infinite Earths number 6. So, one of the things about Crisis is obviously published over a whole year, but it was on the side for like a lot of these books, which is something that I find rather quaint. Certainly for this day and age, everything doesn't stop for the event, have the event, and then start back up again or roll into the other event. Let's talk about 2 DC Comics Presents stories next. DC Comics Presents 82, which is Adam Strange. And then DC Comics Presents 85, which will be Swamp Thing. Okay. Superman and Adam Strange, written by Cary Bates and drawn by Klaus Janson. What did you think?
I thought it looked great. I love the Klaus Janson art.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff at the end where Superman is kind of communing with and memorializing the dead spirits of Krypton, that is something that is visited a couple times in this volume. I think kind of the ghost of Krypton's past, right? I think that's something that Alan Moore pays a little lip service to later. The stuff with the Kryptonian succubus disguised as Adam Strange's wife was interesting. It reminded me of something Tom King would do.
Yeah.
Because it's so often said that like it's always the wife's fault or whatever in his book. Right. I don't know. Whatever. I don't know if that's true or not. But there's a similar thing in his Strange Adventures, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, otherwise I just really liked looking at this one. Janson's art is so, again, just different from the traditional Superman stuff at the time. It's almost impressionistic at times, the facial expressions and things like that. And when he makes those choices, they never seem to be the wrong one either. Like sometimes it can be really uncanny when artists do that. And it's maybe like reminiscent of the slight criticism I have of Gil Kane's Superman sometimes, where the faces almost look too uncanny for their own good, just occasionally, not often. But here I feel like Janson's always making the right choice. Yeah, he can draw like kind of a golden age face where the characters have like a smirk and a gleam in their eye or whatever. Or he can also very much be of the 80s where things are a little darker and I don't want to say grim, but things are not always sunny in his work. And just every time I see Janson, I become more of an appreciator than I was before, I think.
I can't think of, that doesn't mean this isn't true, but I in some ways can't think of a better artist working on newsprint than Janson, especially when he's allowed to do his full penciling, inking, and coloring. Everyone thinks of his work with Frank Miller. Miller realized that Janson was a better artist than he was certainly in terms of like rendering. So for the second half of their Daredevil run, Miller was doing more like storytelling layout, less and less detailed, and just basically saying, here's kind of what I need, Klaus, do your thing. So to see him, this is now 84. So this is a couple of years after that. He's really sort of getting into his own to be able to do stuff like this. This issue in particular, which I have to thank Michel Fife for pointing out. I had no idea this thing existed until he is also a big Klaus fan. That's something we share. He was like, you've got to check this out. And I saw this. I was like, oh shit. Yeah, this has to go. Klaus's rendering, Klaus's color choices, Klaus's use of zipatone and shading. Like if you're looking on page 3, where you have the explosion of, I guess, Ron, and you have Adam Strange sort of like in the foreground. It's almost like he's being lit by the exploding light in the panel behind him. So he's sort of in shadow, but it's done through the use of like not just sort of inking, but also a toning. It's just so, oh man, it's so good. And the whole issue is like that in a way that it doesn't have to be, but it is, and that makes it better. and especially the last page where we see the fact that the last 6 panels are wordless always strikes me. Mm-hmm. Because Klaus is obviously selling it with his art, but Bates and or the editor knew enough to lay off, which is something. There's at least one instance later on where I wish they would have, and they didn't, and I will point that out. But this issue really comes together artistically in a way that reminds me that there were hidden gems, and this certainly was one of them. Moving on to DC Comics Presents 85, the first appearance by one Alan Moore, with the character he was writing monthly at the time, Swamp Thing, and Our Last Son of Krypton. What did you think of this?
I obviously I like all the Alan Moore stuff, definitely. I love how, I'm going to skip right to the end. I love how Superman wakes up thinking that he healed himself on his own somehow, which is very much I don't think it rubs dirt on Superman. It's not like he's arrogant or something, but it's that, he's so used to overcoming all these odds all the time through a variety of powers that, and over the years, he's constantly gaining and losing powers. So for him to just wake up and assume that he did the healing on his own is a fun touch on those grounds. But it also it's so fitting for the Swamp Thing character and for Moore's take on Swamp Thing to be this, I don't know, sin eater or something, whatever you want to say, that just happens in the background and does his thing, probably saves all of humanity by saving Superman's life, and just sinks back into the swamp and no recognition. It's really cool.
Yeah, this issue also drawn by Rick Veitch, inked by Al Williamson. Veitch was one of the guys in the art orbit of Swamp Thing, either officially or he was a friend of Steve Bissette, so he would help out. So he's obviously no stranger to Swamp Thing. Williamson continues to be the inker of choice, maybe in some ways kind of helping hew the Veitch stuff closer to that Kurt Swan aesthetic, maybe, because we see Veitch a little later on and it's maybe a little more horrific, but this issue has some really good Superman horror.
Yeah, well, he looks awful in a lot of these panels. I mean that in a good way. Veitch can draw a very ill Superman. He's sweaty.
Yeah, Veitch can draw an ill anybody.
Yeah.
I enjoy the guy's work, but almost in the same way that the unfortunately late Kevin O'Neill, his art, I mean, the story of, his art was basically deemed inappropriate by the Comics Code.
Yeah. Which is
hilarious. But in that way, Kevin O'Neill drawing a beautiful person, they can be beautiful, but there's a hint of something in there that he just can't pull from his artwork. Veitch is the same way. Even when he's drawing beautiful, perfect people, there's a little something in there that just kind of feels a little off. So when he has to dial it up in horror work, man, it is there. But here, obviously, the Swamp Thing stuff he's good at. Showing Superman in real terror is a little unsettling. There's this little undercurrent of, and there are a couple of panels where it's about halfway through the book when Superman starts hallucinating and the whatever the hell that thing is picks him up from the ground, and he's holding on to its tusks, and it's talking to him, and it's the bottom of this page, and just the way that is staged, the staging of it and stuff, I thought was really striking. So now we're going to Superman Annual 11 for the Man Who Has Everything. Before we recorded, I asked Vince to ponder a particular question. Do you remember how I worded that?
Oh, which holds up best in 2022?
Yeah, this is the comic I was talking about.
Okay.
So before I get into that, not to prejudice how you talk about this, but what did you think of, I'm assuming, revisiting?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I love this one. What stood out for me this time around is how actually grim the aspects of the version of Old Krypton in the Black Mercy dream kind of are. There's basically a KKK rally going on Old Krypton at a certain point. And my recollection of the story, it had been years since I guess I'd probably seen the cartoon more recently, but it had been years and years since I'd read the actual comic story, and I couldn't remember that aspect of it. In my mind, I think, oh no, the Black Mercy is showing him a world that's all rosy and perfect, and that's not actually true.
No.
It's showing Superman a world that is pleasing to him in some way and emotionally resonant and magnetic, but it's not all sunshine and roses, which I thought was particularly interesting revisiting it. That was the big takeaway for how this hit me this time around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my history with this story is I read it when I was 10, and I know that because I got it as a birthday gift on my 10th birthday. My folks had a birthday party. They gave the kids a limit of like $5. And so one of my friends had his mom take him to a comic store. It's like, what's a Superman comic that's $5? This one is the one that they picked. So
what a gift.
I like, in some ways I look back on my comic book life and I was like, I kind of lead a bit of a charmed comic book life to have some random Superman story be this fucking comic. So I read it, and of course this is, for folks that don't know, this is of course written by Alan Moore, drawn by Dave Gibbons, lettered by Dave Gibbons, colored by Tom Ziuko, and of course edited by Julie Schwartz. So this is essentially the Watchmen crew without John Higgins on color, but there are still some really interesting color things going on here. So reading it that first time, I did remember it being disturbing. The Krypton aspects at the time really stood out for me. In retrospect, I was thinking about this today. I kind of feel like this is, in some ways, my platonic ideal of a superhero story. The way it's constructed, what it does, what it's trying to do. This is perfect in a way. And it's interesting, in the early 2000s, Avatar put out their Alan Moore's How to Write Comics, or Guide to Writing Comics, or whatever, which reprinted a editorial that he had written a little after this came out. So let's say like 86-ish, where he obviously talks about how to write comics. And when he's talking about plotting a book, he actually dissects how he put this story together. So we get as close to a director's commentary or writer's commentary from Moore about how this story was put together, which is fascinating. I hope, if you get a chance to read it, it's interesting in some ways because of how matter of fact he is about it. He's like, well, the basic idea is, Superman has these flashbacks to what Krypton would have been if it didn't blow up, but he eventually realizes that it's just a fantasy and it wouldn't have worked out anyway, and that's fine. And I want to have that with this fight against Mongol, who's a character he was interested in. So he's like, okay, I've got 40 pages to do that, so I need to break this part into 20 pages and this part into 20 pages. I want to have him going back and forth, and and it's so, watching him be so kind of matter of fact about it. I mean, he doesn't talk about obviously the thinking he had to do to get to this place, but I find this comic so perfectly executed and balanced, as almost as much as anything that you see in Watchmen. Obviously, Watchmen is pulling more pieces into it, but this is so good. And as you mentioned a little earlier, there was a Justice League Unlimited adaptation of this story, which is, if not the only piece of media that Alan Moore allowed his name to be attached to, it's one of the very few, right? So if that's not a ringing endorsement of it, I don't know what is. And it's interesting to read this story and to see the adaptation, which was handled by the usual Bruce Timm folks, and I think J.M. DeMatteis did the actual screenplay for it.
I think you're right, yeah.
How much they changed, but how much they were still able to invoke even when they weren't using actual pieces of dialogue. One of the things I like, we've seen this in a couple other issues, and we'll certainly see this sort of through the rest of the book, is the use of color holds, which was something that you really saw a lot of in comics. So for what I'm talking about, like on page 1, the first panel, the reddish stuff in the very, very background. When you have line art that is a solid color other than black, that is, if I'm remembering correctly, called a color hold. And you'll see that used. Jansen used it in a couple of his earlier issues, and it gives a nice textural separation in its usage. Obviously, Moore and Gibbons come from a science fiction background, right? They're 2000 AD alums. And so their handling of old Krypton or new Krypton very much plays into their strengths of, certainly Gibbons' designs and everything. Even the way that it moves from when you see the different Black Mercy flashbacks, the Krypton stuff has a red border around it. The Mongol stuff has like a black border, and the Bruce Wayne stuff, I think, has like a dark blue or something. So they don't do the sepia tone or do different coloring inside each one of these different things, but there is something done on the page to give you a little help in realizing sort of where you are. Mm-hmm. So you've read more DC comics than I have. In terms of Black Mercy stories, I wouldn't necessarily say where does this rank, because I have a pretty good idea of where it does. Have there been any uses of the Black Mercy that you felt have done justice to this?
There was one. Oh God. And you're putting me on the spot here, so I'm not going to be able to remember the writer. There was an Aquaman one not that long ago. It was within the last 5 years. It was a annual. Let me do a quick Google while I kind of
keep talking. I'll do it. Okay. Keep talking. I'll do it. Aquaman annual. It was like Max Fiumara, right? Was the artist?
Was the artist. Yep. It was Aquaman Annual Volume 8, number 1. And who was the damn
Philip
writer?
Kennedy Johnson.
Oh, it was Philip Kennedy. Okay. Still one of the best things I think he has ever written. Some people said at the time that, it's just a ripoff of For the Man Who Has Everything. Well, yeah, of course it is. It's the Black Mercy story. Like, what are you gonna do about it? Like, if you're gonna write a Black Mercy story, they're all gonna be compared to For the Man Who Has Everything, and it's not as good. But I think, and I don't know that Fiumara is Dave Gibbons, but I think it's an appropriately kind of big time artist for his era to be drawing a story like that. And and I think it evokes some of the same like real emotion. In fact, it does even more with the idea that Aquaman and Mera have a son. There's quite a bit of emotion rendered from that. But I don't think it's as good, but it's certainly a worthy. If you're interested in more stories like this, that's kind of the one that I always think of. And the Black Mercy's been used a few times over the years, but if you asked me to recall any from memory, that would be the only one that I could. In fact, I was so inspired by reading that annual. I thought it was so good that I came out of retirement from writing reviews at Multiversity to write a review. I asked Brian if I could write a review of it because I thought it was so good. And I can't remember what I gave it, but
probably something good.
It was high marks.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's no For the Man Who Has Everything. Nothing is.
Even just like with the page transitions, a scene and then someone will say a line of dialogue that really applies to the next scene, which is usually on a page turn, which I know gets overused. And that's not the only way to do a transition, but god damn, it is just done so well here.
We are reading Morrison's Animal Man for the DC 3Cast Patreon project, if I can get a plug in.
Absolutely.
And Animal Man is full of that. It's full of a character saying something, and then it applies to the next. It applies to both the previous and the next panel, and it's. I don't know. I would say that it's overused, except that it's extremely well done and satisfying almost every time I've encountered it.
It's only when people are trying to use it and they don't know how to use it that it gets to be tedious. And not that Moore invented it. Maybe he did. I don't know. Probably not. But he certainly knows how to use it. It's so good. But the reason I picked this as the one that hits the hardest is for the reason that you had mentioned earlier, seeing the Krypton stuff and that feeling of dread. the first page of this, it's my birthday, blah, blah, everything. He is content. And then like immediately after, everything starts turning to shit, as I'm assuming this is Kal-El trying to resist, right? So he's, saying this isn't right. This isn't right. So then we have, of course, Clark talking to Jor-El, who, Krypton didn't blow up. So Jor-El is there, and he was called essentially crazy for thinking Krypton wasn't going to blow up. So having Clark talking to his father, who has clearly sort of gone off the rails, and saying maybe Krypton should have blown up. Things are really bad. And Clark's like, change is hard. And having the older guy just being like, nope, we need to make this place great again. He doesn't actually say that, but that's what I'm like, oh, shit. But then slowly, like, Krypton is in some way sort of destroying itself around Clark as we go and we see these things. That dread is really, really palpable. Moore is lacing in all of these little Krypton things. So like his son is playing with the nurse as he goes in to see Kara, who's been attacked by a mob because they figured out that she was related to Jor-El because of like the Phantom Zone. Right, like there's Phantom Zone protests about how it's inhuman, and his son is playing Nightwing and Flamebird, and what do they call the essentially Transformers? But Moore comes up with a really neat little metal giant converts into a trundle gun, and you're like, oh, it's Megatron, because this is 85 86, obviously. Super Transformer stuff. Clark is married to the actress that we saw him marry back in Clark's Return to Krypton, one of the the issue that we kick off the first volume with. So Moore really does his homework in terms of like having this be sort of the future that Clark would have put together. And then, interestingly enough, when we see in the episode, it's a different Clark. So the Black Mercy stuff is reordered a little differently. So in that one, he's grew up as a farmer. So his perfect Krypton, he's a farmer. His wife is a combination of Lois and Lana. It's not this other actress. His father is not as crazy, but there is still that that tension. And just the thing that really, really, really gets me is, of course, we see Jor-El at the Sword of Ra rally, right? Like Kal-El is trying to get his son like out of the city. Like things are going to shit, and they get stopped because there's this fascist rally that Grandpa Jor-El is now at the head of, and of course there are the Phantom Zone protesters, and there's the cops, and this riot breaks out, and Clark is like, I think we need to get out of here. And his son is like, why is Grandpa shouting about the world ending? And Clark is like, your grandfather's world ended 20 years ago. Let's get out of here. But that last panel has this Dave Gibbons image of, you have the Sword of Ra cultists, who of course all have swords, right? They're hacking at these protesters. The cops, you would hope, would be in between the two, but no, they, in their riot gear, are also taking their clubs against the protesters. And I gotta say, looking at that in 2022, that shit looks that's like extra disturbing. And then there's the scene where Clark says, I don't think you're real anymore, to his son as he's crying. And as a 10-year-old, fuck. That just destroyed me. And the episode changed a lot of stuff, but that moment, George Newbern as Superman, it gets me. It's it's good stuff. So yeah, this one is worth revisiting. Obviously, it is on DC Infinite and has been reprinted multiple times. Never gets old. All right. So now we're getting into Crisis number 7. Spoiler, the death of Supergirl. And the couple of issues I have after that, DC Comics Presents 87 and Superman 414 are him trying to return the body to her parents, his aunt and uncle. I guess because a cousin. I know you guys have talked about Crisis on your show multiple times, but now seeing it sort of in this context, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, it was fun seeing that issue in isolation. Mm-hmm. Obviously, a really great, tragic issue for the Super family, but a good showcase of them for this volume for sure. And then I had never read the subsequent DC Comics Presents issue and the Superman issue that you included. So it was fun to read where that story kind of went outside of Crisis. Now, I'm very familiar with DC Comics Presents 87 because it's referenced basically anytime we see Superboy Prime.
Uh-huh.
Including quite explicitly, there was a Superboy Prime one shot as part of Death Metal, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically revisited this exact scenario on Earth Prime with Lori Lemon and him learning how to fly or whatever on the beach as the infinite Earths are converging and kind of warping things. So I'm very familiar with that, but to actually read the original issue was fun. Again, great Kurt Swan art on both of these, and then of course Perez in the Crisis issue.
Yeah.
Doesn't get better than that. So yeah, I think it's a neat inclusion in this volume because it gives you a taste of the Crisis stuff, which is obviously essential. But if you want to read Crisis, just read Crisis, right?
Yeah.
Like read the whole thing. But if you want to read Superman in the Bronze Age, to read that issue and then have a couple that kind of spiral out of it is a really nice touch.
I was thinking about if I were able to sort of shorten some of these, because that Crisis 7 is, double sized, and you could cut a bunch of the like origin of the universe stuff, but I think it works fine to have them in there almost as like scene setting, even if you don't need it for like the rest of that particular issue. It is a nice little look into sort of what was going on with the larger story. The stuff afterwards starts with Superman trying to take the body back, and then it kind of goes off on this mission. I like having it in there. If I had to lose something for space, I would probably try and cut some of this stuff out, just because I think you can get some of that from earlier stuff. The thing that I alluded to earlier about them leaving something in that should have been cut was at the end of Superman 414. He finally goes back, he gets her body, and he does actually take it back to his aunt and uncle. He lands in front of their house. He walks up to them holding her body wrapped up in a cape. And of course, they're like, "What do you have there?" "It looks like ... a cape." And he says, "Uncle Zor-El and Allura, may I come inside for a minute?" And whoever wrote this, which I will... Megan? Okay, good. He's like, "It is an unnatural thing for parents to mourn a child. Unnatural, yet it happens all the time. And it is best to share such grief. So it goes." And so he's got this really nice narration as Superman is walking in and the parents are sort of realizing sort of what happens. The final panel is outside, and it's great other than this sound effect of the scream. But sometimes you can't make an onomatopoeia that looks like appealing. So it's like, it's EEEYAAAAHHHH, exclamation point. And I'm like, the narration did that so well. Like, don't put in yeah. So, okay, home stretch-ish sort of here. The last issue of DC Comics Presents, number 97, is a Phantom Zone.
Yeah, it rounds out that thing from the second volume we read.
Yeah, the Steve Gerber, Gene Colan. What did you think of this? Did you appreciate its inclusion?
Yeah, and I really liked the Phantom Zone mini when we talked about it on the last show. I was surprised to find it pop up here. It was published much later chronologically, right? So, and it's got a little bit of, does it have anything about the Crisis in it? I can't remember now.
I don't think so. It mentions it explicitly as pre-Crisis.
Oh, okay, yeah. So yeah, I almost wonder. I wish I would have known that this existed because I would have read it after the 4-issue mini. Because returning to it a few months later, I think it just wasn't as fresh in my mind. So if I think it needs to be included, but if anything, I might bump it to that second volume, even though chronologically it's way ahead of some of that other stuff.
Yeah, but
I enjoyed returning to it. We talked last time about how different the art is and kind of how it comes from the horror school of comics, and that definitely plays out just as much here. There's some very gruesome stuff here.
Yeah.
There's a Bizarro Superman that gets his head cut off. It's bloodless, but it's no less gruesome.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think you make an excellent point about its placement. One of the reasons I put it here is because the last story that's after this has like a similar feel to it in a way of just like, what the fuck is going on? And there's some characters that overlap. So maybe I was thinking of that.
That's true. I didn't think of that. Yeah.
But in retrospect, I think that's maybe 6 of one, half a dozen of another. So having seen this, we have 2 more comics to talk about. One story, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. When did you first read these?
Oh, probably 15, 20 years ago, when I was trying to read all the classics, when I was diving in and reading all the Alan Moore stuff. And yeah, because I was told, as a younger man that Alan Moore was kind of the biggest deal in comics, the only thing that really mattered, right? Read Watchmen and read these Superman stories, and Swamp Thing. You don't need anything else. And I don't know if that's true, but certainly essential stuff. And same with For the Man Who Has Everything. It had been quite some time since I revisited this. This is of the 2. I love For the Man Who Has Everything, but I think I slightly prefer this one. We'll get to it, but I think it all has to do with that ending. I love the ending of this.
Yeah, I think it could go either way. I came onto this, hadn't really read much Bronze Age Superman before this. So it was tying off an era that I did not have any real sort of firsthand knowledge of. So my appreciation for it has grown as I've read more of the stuff that went into it to realize the toys that Moore was playing with. But the mechanics of how this story is told really shone through before and after, and that is also something I appreciate more and more. No pun intended. So, of course, written by Alan Moore, both issues penciled by Kurt Swan. The first issue inked by George Perez. The second issue inked by Murphy Anderson. Or is it Schaffenberg?
Now I'm unsure.
Oh no, it is Schaffenberger.
Okay.
Anderson did the cover. So it's a Swanderson cover, but it is Kurt Schaffenberger. Man, you are on fire. I was like, I know this stuff, and you're like, actually, no, it's good. It keeps
I don't mean to be an actually.
Oh no,
guy.
no, like no. It's totally good.
I gotta say too, before we move on, you mentioned the cover. 2 things I love about that cover. Number 1, down in the bottom left corner, the Who Watches the Watchmen.
Oh yeah.
Barcode goes or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the fact that Superman is frowning,
Yeah.
What a way to end pre-crisis milieu than to have this cover of Superman flying away and he's frowning. That's not, and I don't even think of it as like the grim and grittying up of comics at all. I just think it's bittersweet to be leaving and there's a lot of great post-crisis stuff. Crisis itself is great. Like there's good comics in every era, but the fact that it's explicitly bittersweet about leaving this particular era, and then you contrast that with the last page of the actual comic, and I think it has like kind of a doubly strong effect, because the cover kind of makes you bittersweet and wistful and a little sad, but then that last page is it's hey, everything's gonna be all right.
Yeah. The cover for 423, the Superman issue, homages a lot of those giant Superman annual covers that have like 5 or 6 sort of panels on them of like, you're going to see this, the new Brainiac Luthor team,
and
or
Crypto the Super.
Yeah. Oh, that's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Whatever Happened to is, of course, a DC Comics Presents backup title. Whenever they would check in on old characters, it'd be Whatever Happened to Airwave, Whatever Happened to Cave Carson. So Whatever Happened to, and of course, Moore is like, well, we can't have Superman. We'll just call him the Man of Tomorrow. And then, of course, everybody uses that for Whatever Happened to, the Dark, or no, was it the Cape Crusader? Cape Crusader, yeah. The Neil Gaiman, Whatever Happened to this? But of course, Alan Moore did it, and it was awesome. Todd Klein letterers for both. Todd Klein was in the DC bullpen at the time, so his letters have shown up in many of these issues, but Of course, it's going to be Todd Klein. Like, oh my God, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
The story starts 10 years after the last time Superman has been seen, and is Lois basically telling a Daily Planet reporter, or a Daily Planet reporter is interviewing her, and she's giving her account of what has happened. So seeing Kurt Swan inked by George Perez made me look. It definitely made me look at Kurt Swan. It unlocked Kurt Swan in a way for me that I could then dive into the more traditional Kurt Swan sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But Perez here, it gives the book a veneer, like a more modern veneer. But it was in going back and looking at more of Kurt Swan's work to see sort of how much of this Kurt Swan would have done anyway in terms of layout and pacing and staging and all of these sort of things. And Perez really did add a wonderful sheen to it. But it wasn't like this is the good issue because George Perez is involved. Like George Perez was the icing on the cake as opposed to the cake. Anything in particular about this first issue before the last scene?
Yeah, just the last scene. Oh my God.
Anything before that?
Yeah, anything before that. It starts off with a premise that I think it's become old hat in comics, but I think it's, for its time, it was pretty novel, which is what if every single villain that a hero has attacks them all at once, basically. Mm-hmm. It's kind of the thing that has become popular with big Batman arcs, where it starts out small and then all of a sudden you find out there's more of his villains involved than you realized. And so it's become a trope, but I think, yet another one of Alan Moore's things that's been referenced over the years or tried to. They always say that Jeff Johns tries to do that with when he writes a character. It basically becomes a big tour of their rogues gallery, and that's basically what this is. But a couple of things in particular that I found fun about it was the new Luthor and the new Brainiac that we kicked off this volume with essentially become merged halfway through, which is it's a fun place for those two characters to go, considering where this volume that you put together started, so that's fun. The Legion showing up and saying goodbye is what a scene.
Yeah. It's so well put together. We see Kurt Swan placing us in that moment, having things in like the foreground and background playing. So Supergirl is there at this point, obviously dead, but Brainiac and Superman are talking. They are obviously upset, talking about her, but he's also able to show their emotions while keeping her visually there. So he's really, really able to do a lot of stuff, not invisibly, but in a way that doesn't call attention to itself, which makes it, for me, more powerful. One of the things I've come to appreciate about Swan is how good he was at doing things economically and cleanly.
Yeah.
The whole thing leads up to, of course, the last page, the construction sort of this page. So Lois is telling this story to the reporter. Her narration is, when I saw Superman the next morning, he looked funny. And the one caption that's on this page is, quote, he looked as if he'd been crying. So this panel is Superman crying after the meeting that he's just had with the Legion and seeing Kara. Krypto is his dog. His master's crying. Krypto is sitting next to Superman. The cape is draped over him, but he's very downbeat. And the angle that Swan has chosen, the fact that we don't really see Superman's face, the body language, the posturing, the fact that he is having such a human moment surrounded by all of these superhuman things and everything in his Fortress of Solitude, fucking chef's kiss. This is so good. Mm-hmm. It is one of the best panels in Superman history.
Yeah.
Right. And you can look at it and see the little bit of texturing in some places that Perez gives, especially when you look at, the next issue, when you've got Schaffenberger doing a much cleaner line. Two great tastes that go great together. I don't necessarily prefer one over the other, but this one, this is so good.
Yeah.
So good. So good. Yeah. Anything you would like to add?
No, you said it all.
Okay. Last issue, Twilight of the Gods here at the Old Fortress of Solitude. What stands out the most other than the ending?
So The Swan art with the Schaffenberger inks, it gives me and I don't know if this is the combination of more being the writer and the sort of the era that it's coming from, but it gives me a Dave Gibbons feel. I mean that as a compliment, or not to say that Kurt Swan can't hold his own, because Kurt Swan's the king of this game, but just kind of the majesty of these characters, the way that they stand, the import of especially by the end, in like the second half of the issue, I would say there's a lot of similar panel work being done to the way that Gibbons does it. Square, evenly sized panels that imbue like a sense of drama or a sense of import to everything, not necessarily action, not necessarily explosive. That stuff all takes place in the earlier half of the issue, but by the end, when it's trying to wrap up its grand story, it takes on this like majesty that I associate with Moore and Gibbons, but now I see that in Moore and Swan as well. So just stylistically, that was my impression of this. But yeah, just the culmination of the Lex and Brainiac stuff, the moment that Superman finally kind of snaps, or not snaps, but like just makes a very decisive decision, and then suffers the consequences of it, or puts those consequences on himself, sentences himself to the gold kryptonite chamber, which is how a story like this should end, right? Like if you're going to make Superman kill, this is something that people smarter than me have talked about over the years, Mark Waid in particular. Got to be a weight to it, consequence, This is as final and consequential as it gets. And we don't want to talk about the last page just quite yet, but at that moment, it's a pretty dire ending for Superman.
Yeah. The moment that stands out for me is a little earlier. It's a storytelling combination that always gets me, and I didn't get it at first. It's when, I guess it's like the morning of. So Superman is talking with Perry White, how much he loves Lois, but how much he's afraid to hurt Lana. And the thing is, so right before this point, Jimmy and Lana have gone down to one of the treasure rooms. And so Jimmy's taking his Elastilad serum, and Lana is taking a dip in whatever the hell pool, magic lake water from some probably unidentified radiation source. So she takes a radiation bath to turn back into to give herself superpowers, I'm sure hearkening back to an earlier thing. So she's in the pool and she's like, I feel my senses expanding, x-ray vision, microscopic vision, and then next panel, super hearing. And as it says that, we've gone into another panel, which is Superman talking to Perry White. So she's basically saying, I now have super hearing. So she's now hearing the confession that Clark could never confess to her. I can't tell Lana how much I love Lois because it'll hurt her, and I'd never hurt her, so I have to walk around with a secret, and I'm carrying, I will carry the secret to my grave. And right under that, we have a Swan close-up of her ear and her eye as if she's, hearing him off to the side. And Superman's like, oh, they'll never know the secret that I carry. She then is getting dressed, and, Jimmy is like, you ready to go do this thing? And she's like, yes. Superman's done so much for us. Let's show him nobody loved him better than us. Nobody. Yeah. I was like, whoa. It's such minor little decisions, right? That's very obvious, but also subtle at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. Not every comic has to be perfect, but like a little more of that not subtle subtlety would just little things like that all throughout these comics. There tend to be more of them, no pun intended, in Alan Moore stories. Mm-hmm. But whenever they show up, those are the sort of things that can really sell, really elevate good stories to great stories, or, shitty stories to stories that I come back to. Is like, well, there's that one beat that I really like. But even though Superman is crying on the cover, even though these two stories have a real body count, I do not think this is a sad story because of the ending. Mm-hmm. How does that ending hit you?
Oh, I love it. It's perfect. It's what I want. Something we talk about on our show quite a bit is how we want the sort of main timeline of DC to move forward at some kind of scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
And well, it would never fly like sales wise or editorial wise. I understand why they can't do that, but these are the kind of moments that I would want to see play out in actual continuity. I think this is such a bold ending. You know, it's so easy to say that Superman ends flying off and doing what he always does. But for him to choose this life of essentially human happiness, that's just like you or I, like it's really bold, but it's really earned after 2 issues of
Mm-hmm.
being put through the ringer. And some people don't like it because they say, well, that's, Superman betraying humanity, or, he'll always be needed or whatever. But I think that there always is a next generation. There's a hint that their son is super powered, and
Mm-hmm.
he turns a piece of coal into a diamond, and there will always be somebody to take up someone's mantle, and Superman deserves an ending like this. And it's something that I would like to see comics play around with more.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, if they did, it maybe wouldn't be special, but not everyone is Alan Moore anyway. So, what's the
That's
difference?
true. Yeah, I don't think there's any reason they couldn't do this, right? Because there's the having it. All right. Putting together a project like this lets you realize that how much enjoyment you can get out of an actual comic book, right? Like you can know there's a wider continuity to it, or whatever, but it helps you, or at least it helps me remember that each one of these things is its own thing, right? Each one of these can be sort of worth something for what it actually is. DC has so much continuity and so many sort of things to play with. And you guys have talked about this on your show multiple times. Why can't you have an Earth 2 sort of universe where you get to have a story like this, or a tying off of a character's history? Like doing this, you can do this and still have Superman stories, right? There's no reason you can't have cake and eat it too, right?
Mm-hmm.
The important thing is that it's a good story.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what we want are just good stories. If they happen to tie it together with other good stories, that's even better. But ultimately, this has to be a good story. And there is no objective reason why they can't do that, other than, your creative team is not up to telling a particularly good story, or the editorial environment that they're in isn't letting them do that, or other like real world concerns that keep things from being perfect, because nobody sets out to tell a bad story. Some of them just don't hit the way that we want to, but when they do, it can inspire people to go off and write better stories, or strip mine that story for everything they can get from it. Home stretch here. Any sort of final thoughts about this book in particular, or about the 3 volumes as a whole?
Well, the project has just been a lot of fun to revisit a few stories I had read and read a lot of stuff that I hadn't yet. And I think you encompass a pretty big era of comics down into a nice little 3 volumes that I think I don't feel like I missed anything.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of know what goes on a bit with the characters in between these issues. You get a sense of that while reading through the 3 volumes, and
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you've got all the essentials and maybe a little more. Particularly this 3rd volume is a really great example of how to tell some really bold, really interesting, thought-provoking stories that either, oh, sure, they're imaginary, or they could be in continuity and it doesn't really matter. I'm thinking of like some of like the Superman 400 stuff with like
Mm-hmm.
future looks at the character's influence. Like, is any of that stuff really in continuity or not? Who knows, but it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Same with the Alan Moore stuff. Like, this one is particularly explicitly called out as an imaginary story, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Moore's narration says, aren't they all?
Yes.
So that is the way to look at comics. And I feel like that's Oh man, that should be the guiding post for people writing
Everything.
comics or everything. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly. Yes, yes,
yeah.
totally.
Oh, yeah. On the one hand, you're like, you don't. I just have this knee jerk reaction to saying everything Alan Moore does is good, or like everything comes from Alan Moore. You're like, look, even he
Yeah,
would say, no, that's a, on the other hand, things keep coming back to stuff that he says like a lot.
yeah.
And putting something like this together, looking back at DC publishing stuff, when they do, the greatest Superman stories ever told, the greatest Batman stories ever told, especially the first volumes, they specifically left out some stories that I thought should be in there because they were collected somewhere else, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the ones that I like, there are these survey books that give you an idea of what was going on, the quote unquote important stuff, but also like the before and after. They're giving you an approximation of what it's like to read these characters over time, which is, if not the reason to do that, it certainly has a different effect in how you approach some of these stories and how you, what you can pull from this. It almost gives you, in some ways, a better appreciation of the good stuff because it's not always it's not always the case,
Yeah,
right? Whereas if you come at it from more of just like a collected type of thing, it's like, oh, here's this graphic novel, here's a graphic novel, you're like, it's all killer, no filler. Sometimes the killer doesn't kill as much if you don't have an idea of how much the filler does not kill,
yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a balance I was trying to go for while still having the filler kill a little bit. I'm trying to make everything worth reading. So yeah, this has been great getting a chance to have somebody to talk to about these stories. If it's DC Comics, obviously I got to get one of the DC3 guys to come in and do this because you are super knowledgeable about this subject. And this has been, no pun intended, super fun to do this.
Yeah, I'd love to do more.